My son skipped his own mother's funeral for a work trip. He sent a text that morning, 3 words, "Can't make it," and boarded a flight to a sales conference in Denver instead. A year later, almost to the day, he called me needing my signature on a document worth a great deal of money to him. I want to tell you what I did with that phone call, and why. Before I go any further, thank you for being here with me tonight. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, your city, your country, wherever you happen to be sitting right now. A small note before we start. This story weaves in some fictional elements for the sake of the telling. The names in the town aren't real, but everything underneath them happened close enough to true that I think it's worth telling. My name is Robert Halloway. I am 73 years old. I spent 38 years as a civil engineer, mostly on municipal water systems, and I was married to my wife, Diane, for 44 years before she passed. I want to tell you about the day my son missed her funeral, and about the phone call, exactly a year later, that told me everything I needed to know about where I actually stood with him. I need you to understand something before this story really gets going. This is not a tale about a father seeking revenge on a grieving son who simply made one terrible mistake under pressure. I am not looking for revenge. What I want, and what I eventually got, was simply clarity, an honest understanding of what my son actually valued, measured not by what he said, but by what he did when it cost him something to choose differently. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you cannot understand that phone call without understanding the marriage, and the son that came before it. I married Diane in 1980. We had our son, Curtis, in 1984, and I want to tell you honestly that Diane was the better parent between the two of us, patient in a way I struggled to be during my busiest working years, the kind of mother who remembered every teacher's name and every friend's birthday without ever seeming to try particularly hard at any of it. I worked long hours on public infrastructure projects across 3 counties, and Diane held our household together in the way so many mothers of that generation did, quietly, competently, without ever once asking for the credit she deserved. There is a memory from our marriage I want to share, because I think it explains something about the kind of partnership Diane and I actually had, and why her absence at that funeral pew felt so much sharper set against it. In 2003, when I was laid off briefly during a municipal budget crisis, Diane took a part-time job at a fabric store, without complaint, without ever once making me feel smaller for needing the help, simply doing what needed doing to keep our household steady until I found work again 4 months later. She never brought it up afterward as something I owed her for. That was simply the shape of how she loved people, quietly, practically, without keeping score. I tell you this because I want you to understand what kind of woman Curtis failed to show up for that Saturday, and because I think it matters to understanding why I could not simply let the absence pass without eventually addressing it directly. Curtis grew up comfortable, in a good school district, with 2 parents who never once raised their voices at each other in front of him, and I want to be honest and tell you that I do not think Curtis ever wanted for anything material in his childhood. He went to a good state university, studied business, and built a genuinely successful career in medical device sales, eventually earning, by his mid-30s, a salary considerably larger than mine had ever been as an engineer. I tell you all of this because I want you to understand that what happened later was not the result of some hard, deprived childhood that left Curtis unable to show up for the people who loved him. He had every advantage. He simply, somewhere along the way, developed a habit of treating his career as the fixed point around which everything else in his life was expected to rearrange itself, including, eventually, his own mother's funeral. I want to tell you about one more incident from Curtis's 20s, because I think it foreshadows the pattern that eventually defined the funeral itself. In 2011, my own mother, Curtis's grandmother, was hospitalized with pneumonia over a holiday weekend, and Curtis, then 27 and newly promoted into his first sales territory, told us he couldn't make the 4-hour drive because of a regional kickoff meeting scheduled for that Monday. Diane had been disappointed, though she never said much about it at the time, simply noting, quietly, to me that evening, that she hoped it wouldn't become a habit. I remember telling her, at the time, that Curtis was still young, still building his career, and that these things had a way of balancing out as a person matured. I want you to notice, looking back, how readily I explained away a pattern that Diane had already, correctly, begun to sense taking shape. Diane was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2022. She fought it for 11 months, and I want to tell you that Curtis was, for most of that stretch, a reasonably attentive son from a distance, regular phone calls, a few visits when his schedule allowed, the kind of involvement that looks sufficient on paper without ever quite translating into the kind of presence his mother actually needed in her hardest final months. I want to tell you about one specific visit, in the autumn of that year, because I think it captures the shape of Curtis's involvement more honestly than a general description could. He came for a single overnight stay, driving 3 hours each direction, and spent much of the actual visit on his phone in the next room, handling what he described as an urgent client matter that could not wait until Monday. Diane, weak from her second round of chemotherapy that week, never once complained about it to him directly. She mentioned it to me only after he'd left, sitting in her recliner with a blanket over her knees, saying simply, "I wish he'd just been here with me, Robert, instead of in the next room. I didn't need him to fix anything. I just needed him to sit with me." I called him myself, on a Tuesday morning in February, to tell him Diane had passed in the night, peacefully, with me beside her. Curtis cried on the phone, genuinely, and told me he'd be there as soon as he could arrange things. I believed him completely. I want you to understand that I had no reason, at that moment, to doubt my son's intentions. The funeral was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving Curtis nearly a full week to arrange his travel and his work obligations. I spoke with him twice more that week, and both times he confirmed he'd be there, that he'd already told his employer the circumstances and expected no difficulty getting the time approved. I want to tell you about the morning of the funeral itself, because I have gone over it many times since, and I want you to have it exactly as it happened. I want to tell you first about the days leading up to it, because I think the anticipation itself matters to the sting of what followed. Diane and I had, over our 4 decades together, planned a great many family gatherings, and I had grown accustomed, over the years, to Curtis being the last piece to confirm, the one whose schedule always seemed to require the most careful coordination. I did not think much of it that week, when his confirmations came a little later than his aunts and cousins had. I had simply grown used to it as part of who my son was, a busy, successful man whose time required careful management, rather than recognizing it, at the time, as a smaller version of exactly the pattern that would eventually cost him his presence at his own mother's funeral entirely. I was standing in my kitchen at 7 that morning, in the suit I had not worn since our 40th anniversary party 2 years earlier, when my phone buzzed with a text from Curtis. 3 words, "Can't make it." I called him immediately, and he picked up on the 4th ring, his voice carrying the particular clipped efficiency of a man walking through an airport terminal. "Dad," he said before I could even ask, "I'm so sorry, there's a regional sales conference in Denver this weekend that got moved up, and my director made it clear attendance wasn't optional if I want to be considered for the district manager position that's opening up. I know the timing is terrible. I'll come visit next month, I promise, and we can do something for Mom together then." I did not raise my voice. I want you to understand that. I told him, calmly, that I hoped the conference went well, and I hung up the phone, and I drove to my wife's funeral alone, and I stood at the front of that church surrounded by 40 years of her friends and colleagues and cousins, and I explained, when people asked, that Curtis had been unable to get away from work. I want to tell you what the day actually looked like beyond that phone call, because I think the fuller texture of it matters. Diane's oldest friend, a woman named Marjorie who had known her since nursing school, sat beside me in that front pew instead, and at one point during the service, she reached over and simply took my hand, without a word, because she had noticed, the way old friends notice things, exactly which seat should have been occupied and wasn't. Several of Diane's cousins asked me, gently, over the reception afterward, where Curtis was, and each time I gave some version of the same answer, that he'd been unable to get away from work, and each time I watched a small, careful flicker of disapproval cross their faces before they politely changed the subject. I need to stop here for a moment, because what I decided to do over the following year is the part that matters most. If you're still with me, drop the number 44 in the comments. That's how many years Diane and I were married, so I know you're still sitting with me through this. Fair warning, the story from here weaves in a few more fictional elements to bring the truth of it to life more clearly. If that's not the kind of telling you're looking for, this is a fine place to step away, with my full respect. For those staying, let's keep going. I did not confront Curtis in anger in the weeks that followed. I want to be honest about why. I was too deep in my own grief that spring to have the energy for a confrontation, and some part of me, I think, was still hoping he would recognize on his own, without needing to be told, exactly what he had missed, and would show up, in some meaningful way, to make it right before I ever had to raise the subject myself. He did not. He called on schedule, roughly every other week, pleasant, checking in, asking how I was managing alone in the house, and not once, in all those calls across the following months, did he ever bring up the funeral itself, or offer anything beyond the vague, unfulfilled promise of that visit he mentioned on the phone from the airport. I want to tell you about the summer following the funeral, because I think the specific texture of that stretch matters. I spent a good deal of it alone, in the house Diane and I had shared for 31 years, learning, slowly and without much grace, how to manage a life that had always had her steady presence built into its structure. I taught myself to cook simple, proper meals rather than living off frozen dinners, mostly because I found the process of following one of Diane's old recipe cards, in her own handwriting, to be a strange and comforting way of feeling close to her. Curtis visited once that summer, in July, for a single weekend, and I want to tell you that the visit itself was pleasant, cordial, entirely without incident, and also entirely without any acknowledgement, on his part, of the funeral he had missed 5 months earlier. I did not raise it myself that weekend. I was still, at that point, waiting to see whether he would raise it on his own. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with my own younger brother, Frank, that spring, because I think it shaped how I eventually responded. Frank had flown in for the funeral himself, from 3 states away, at his own expense, on 2 days' notice, and sitting with him on my back porch a few weeks later, I told him honestly how hurt I was that Curtis hadn't managed the same. Robert, Frank said, I'm not going to tell you what to feel about your own son. But I will tell you this. A man shows you what he actually values by what he's willing to lose something for. Curtis didn't lose anything that weekend. He chose a conference over his mother's funeral, and as far as I can tell, it cost him nothing at all. I think you're going to have to decide, at some point, whether you're comfortable with that math continuing indefinitely. I want to tell you more about that conversation with Frank, because I think it went further than I've told you so far, and I think the fuller shape of it matters. I pushed back on him a little, that afternoon, telling him that Curtis had a genuinely demanding career, that these things sometimes really were as complicated as they seemed. Frank had looked at me steadily, the particular look of a younger brother who has watched you make excuses for people your whole life and has finally decided to say something about it. Robert, he said, I had a demanding career too. I ran a whole regional office for 18 years. I still got on a plane with 2 days' notice for my sister-in-law's funeral, because some things simply matter more than a career, and a man who's built his priorities correctly knows the difference without needing to be told. I'm not saying Curtis is a bad son. I'm saying he's had every comfort handed to him his whole life, and comfort like that sometimes teaches a person that inconvenience is something other people are supposed to absorb on his behalf. I sat with Frank's words for a long while that spring. I did not act on them immediately. I simply began, quietly, to pay closer attention to the actual shape of my relationship with my son, rather than the comfortable assumptions I had been making about it for years. The call came almost exactly a year later, in February, a few weeks before the anniversary of Diane's passing. Curtis called on a Thursday evening, his voice carrying a warmth and urgency I hadn't heard from him in months. Dad, he said, I need to ask you something important. Remember the property Mom and you co-owned with me on paper, the rental house on Fielding Street, the one that's still technically in both our names from when we refinanced it together back in 2015? I've got an opportunity to use it as collateral for a business venture, a partnership stake in a medical device distribution company. Genuinely a great opportunity. But I need your signature on the refinancing documents to move forward. Time sensitive, Dad. The partners need an answer by the end of next week. I asked him, calmly, to tell me more about the venture itself, and he did, at some length, clearly excited, clearly certain this would be the deal that finally moved him into the income bracket he'd been chasing for years. I told him I needed a few days to think it over, which seemed to surprise him. Dad, he said, it's just a signature. It's not like I'm asking you for money. I told him, gently, that it wasn't quite that simple to me, and that I'd call him back by the weekend. I want to tell you what I actually did with those few days, because I think it matters more than anything I could tell you about the phone call itself. I drove out to Diane's grave, as I did most weeks by then, and I sat there for a long while, thinking about the morning of her funeral, about the empty seat in the front pew that everyone had noticed and no one had mentioned directly, about Curtis's voice on the phone that morning, apologetic but entirely unwilling to actually change his plans. I also called Marjorie, Diane's old friend, during those few days, simply because I wanted to hear another honest perspective before I made my decision. Robert, she told me, over the phone, I loved that boy since he was in diapers, and I'm not going to pretend I wasn't hurt watching that pew sit empty at his own mother's funeral. But I think the real question isn't whether you forgive him. I think you already have, in your heart, the way a father always does. The real question is whether you're going to keep handing him things of value without him ever once having to prove he's changed. Those are two very different questions, Robert, and I think you already know which one you're actually wrestling with. I called Curtis back that Sunday evening. Curtis, I said, I'm not going to sign the refinancing documents. His voice went sharp with surprise. Dad, why not? This is a real opportunity. I don't understand. I need you to understand something, Curtis, I said, and I kept my voice steady, though it cost me something to keep it that way. A year ago, your mother died, and you chose a sales conference over her funeral. You told me, at the time, that attendance wasn't optional, that your career depended on it. I accepted that, at the time, because I was too deep in my own grief to argue about it. But I've had a year to think about what that choice actually told me, and what it told me is that when something asks you to genuinely sacrifice for the people who love you, you consistently choose your career instead, every single time, without exception. And now you're asking me to put my name, and my financial standing, behind another one of your career opportunities, at real risk to myself, with no more guarantee of your reliability than I had a year ago when you told me you'd visit and never did. Dad, that's not fair, he said, his voice cracking slightly. That was different. I explained the situation. You explained the situation, I said, but you never once changed the outcome, Curtis. Not that weekend, and not in any of the months since. I love you, and I am not angry in the way that wants to punish you. But I am not willing to sign my name to something that puts my own financial security at risk for a son who has shown me, clearly and repeatedly, that his own convenience comes first. If you want my trust back, Curtis, it doesn't start with a signature. It starts with you actually showing up, consistently, for the people in your life, the way you show up for your career. There was a long silence on the line. I don't know what to say, Dad, he finally said. You don't have to say anything tonight, I told him. But I think you should think honestly about what I've said the same way I've spent this past year thinking honestly about what you did. He called back 3 days later, and I want to tell you about that second call, because I think it reveals something important about how Curtis actually processed what I'd said. His voice, this time, carried none of the earlier urgency, replaced instead by something quieter, more uncertain. Dad, he said, I talked to my business partners. They understood, mostly, though I could tell they were disappointed. I've been thinking about what you said, about the funeral. I told myself, for a whole year, that you'd understood, that we'd moved past it, because you never brought it up again after that first phone call. I think I mistook your silence for forgiveness, and I don't think those were ever actually the same thing, were they? No, I told him. They weren't. I want to tell you that Curtis did not get the business opportunity he was hoping for. The partnership fell through within a month, once his other financing options failed to materialize in time. I did not feel triumphant hearing this. I felt, instead, a complicated grief, the particular ache of watching your own child face a real consequence you did nothing to cause, but also did nothing to soften. I want to tell you about a conversation we had roughly 6 months later, because I think it captures something important about where things eventually landed between us. Curtis called, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, simply to talk, the way he used to before all of this. And near the end of the call, he said quietly, Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About showing up. I think I've been telling myself for years that being successful was the same thing as taking care of the people who matter to me, and I don't think that's actually true. I'm sorry about the funeral, Dad. I should have found a way. I know I should have. I told him I appreciated him saying that, and that I believed he meant it. And that the only thing that would actually prove it, going forward, was consistent action rather than another well-meant conversation. I want to tell you about one specific thing Curtis did the following spring, because I think it mattered more to me than almost anything he could have said. My hip replacement surgery was scheduled for a Wednesday in April, a routine procedure but one that still required someone to drive me home and stay the first night. Curtis took 2 full days off work without being asked, drove 4 hours each way, and sat with me through the entire recovery, missing, as it happened, a regional sales meeting he would once have considered non-negotiable. He never once mentioned the meeting to me. I only learned about the scheduling conflict weeks later, from a colleague of his I happened to run into at a hardware store, and I want to tell you that learning it secondhand, rather than having Curtis announce it as some grand gesture, meant considerably more to me than if he'd made a show of the sacrifice himself. I want to tell you about one more moment from that recovery, because I think it captures something the whole ordeal had genuinely changed in him. On the second night, unable to sleep well because of the surgical pain, I found Curtis sitting in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, going through one of Diane's old recipe boxes I'd left out on the counter. Dad, he said, when he noticed me in the doorway, I never really learned any of Mom's recipes. I always figured there'd be more time. He held up a card. Her handwriting faded slightly at the edges. A simple pot roast recipe she made every winter of my childhood. "Will you teach me this one sometime?" he asked. I told him I would, and I want you to understand that small request, at 2 in the morning in my own kitchen, meant more to me than any apology he could have offered in words alone. I want to tell you about a conversation we had at Diane's grave together, the following February, on the 2nd anniversary of her passing, because I think it closes this story properly. Curtis had asked if he could come with me that year, something he had never once done before, and we stood together at her headstone for a long while in the cold, either of us saying much. Eventually Curtis said quietly, "I think about that funeral almost every week, Dad. Not in a way that makes me feel worthless anymore. In a way that reminds me what I actually owe the people I love, which is just showing up, especially when it's inconvenient. I think that's the whole lesson, isn't it?" I told him I thought that was exactly the whole lesson, and we stood there together a while longer before driving home. If there is a lesson in this story, and I believe there is one, it is this. Love is not measured in the promises a person makes when things are calm. It is measured in what they are willing to sacrifice when something genuinely costs them. My son told me, for years, that he loved his mother completely, and I believe he did, in his own way. But love that only shows up when it's convenient is not the same thing as love a person can actually depend on, and I was not willing to extend my trust, or my signature, to a version of my son that had not yet proven he understood the difference. If any part of this story stayed with you tonight, tell me in the comments. I read every one. Subscribe if you'd like to stay close. There is more of this family's story worth telling. Thank you truly, for staying with me all the way to the end. One final note before you go. The chapters in this telling carry fictionalized elements woven in to bring a human truth to life more clearly. If that isn't the kind of content you're looking for, no hard feelings at all. Choose what serves you, and take good care of yourself.